I want to kick things off. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Grant Deacon. I'm the founder and CEO here at Unstack. I just want to say first off, thanks for joining us. We're excited to have everybody here. We're excited really to cover this topic, which I think is near and dear to everybody on this call and startups at large. For those of you who don't know much about Unstack, our mission is really to enable startups and agile teams to build, measure, and scale their digital presence. So our flagship product is really our all-in-one website builder and landing page engine. Today, we're going to talk about something that I think pretty much every startup is going through, and which is how do you drive towards product market fit? What's your sort of go-to-market strategy, and really what role does product marketing play in helping you get there, and how do you accelerate towards that? I talk to a lot of founders all the time, and even at Unstack as we're building, and this is something that Mark will talk about. There's kind of this fire, aim, ready approach oftentimes, which, we're out trying different channels. We're testing different things. We have different ideas, but they're not always baked into sort of a solid foundational strategy and hypothesis that we're using to really understand who the customer is and then build around that customer. And so when I met Mark a few months ago, we started talking about this and collaborated on a couple of different things. And I really felt like, being able to bring someone in who's been doing this, and I'm going to use Mark's words, since the turn of the century, bringing that layer of experience in. Mark has been doing this as a CMO at larger companies and also at the pre-seed level and everything in between, really helping to solve those fundamental questions. And so, I asked Mark, hey, would you come in and spend an hour with our companies and people in the community who are really trying to work through these questions. And at the end of this, you should really be able to come out of this with some specific ideas, questions, and frameworks. And really, if nothing else, just kind of elevate your thinking about product marketing and how to use it as a tool in your toolkit to get where you want to go faster. And so Mark Shapiro is the CEO and the founder of the Agile Product Marketing Group here in Boston. Mark, I'm really excited to have you on. I have a lot of questions. I'm kind of treating myself a little bit as like a delegate for all these other founders and marketers that are on this call. So I'll try to ask great questions, but I do also need help from the audience here today. Drop any questions that you guys have in the Q&A section. Don't do it in the comments because we might not see them. So definitely use that Q&A, and we'll hold a lot of the questions towards the end. We're going to try to reserve, Mark, I think probably 15 plus minutes just to get into some of the questions that folks have. So I want to turn it over to you, Mark. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to go through this deck. It's packed full of stuff. So I want to just turn it over to you.
And thanks for having me. I mean, not to sound too self-serving, but you folks on the call are, going to leave here a leg up on the competition because, like Grant said, I've worked with companies at varying stages, and even some of the larger ones that aren't as mature in terms of how they approach product marketing. And again, I think you'll kind of see, if you're not familiar with it already, how it can impact your business, especially at the early stages. So without further ado, I will launch into this. And so, just to kind of the takeaways that you're gonna get from this, what I'm gonna go through is that we're gonna start off talking about how there's defects in how you approach it that can inhibit your growth and cause your startup to fail. The margin for error in a startup is next to nothing, and sort of talk about what is that architecture for growth. The product marketing function, if you will, is sort of the architects, and they make the blue plan. And I'll go through like what is the profile of a product marketer / growth architect look like, and kind of wrap it up, go full circle with this to address how those defects can be removed from your process and make you successful. And again, we'll open it up. We can walk through some examples. We can have discussion. We'll see where this all takes us. So if I can actually get my navigation stuff right. So what you're seeing here is from CB Insights. They did a survey of a couple hundred startups, and they identified the top 20 reasons that startups fail. These obviously are the top 10 that you can see right here. And the premise is that product marketing can have an impact on all of these reasons in varying degrees, and it can affect them. And so what I have here is that I say shift left. And that's really where this all starts, because if you're familiar with the concept of software development, shifting left is when you do the testing early, when you set your, and we're having a little bit of technical difficulties, is where you find where there's defects in your software. You go through that process earlier, because the longer it takes, the more costly it is to fix. I mean, think about it when you have a recall on your car, how costly that is for, whoever the car manufacturer is. Whereas if they found that defect earlier, it's a fraction of the cost. Similar concept when we're talking about you're in a startup and the product marketing function, and how it can go through and architect things from the start, and test things and find those defects earlier rather than later, so that you're not spending money, you're not burning cash, you're being more effective in terms of who you're targeting, and you're on a growth trajectory that's more like a hockey stick and less like a shovel. So this ought to look pretty familiar to most folks on this call. It's the lean canvas. And that's really, I think, summarizes how product marketing fits into the equation. All those boxes on the lean canvas are ones that are owned by product marketing. So while if you're familiar with product marketing, maybe if you worked at a larger company and you work with people in that function, they usually sit between sort of the corporate marketing, the other facets of marketing, which are numerous and many, and also between the sales team and the product team, and more frequently now through the customer success teams. And so while most of the people on this call probably don't have that level of structure in their organization, that doesn't change the role that product marketing plays here. So I just kind of want to get out of the way what is at times a perception that, well, product marketing is for when you're a bigger company, you're at a more mature stage. And I'd like to just put that to rest, to say I've worked with two companies that are pre-revenue, that are seed stage, and we've had big impact on what we're able to do with them in terms of helping them to validate their market, doing customer discovery and things like that. So it's not just for big companies, it's not for later stage companies. So what is the product marketing charter? And what I'm going to be presenting at times will be sort of the full view, if you will, in terms of what the function is responsible for in an organization. And, you need to right size that for where you are. I mean, when I talk about sales enablement, you may not have a sales team yet, but at the same time, if somebody's out there selling in your company, there's a degree of enablement that needs to take place. If you're, say, for example, a technical founder, and you're not all that experienced in selling and meeting customers and on the sales side, as opposed to how the product works, that's critically important to you. So product marketing owns the funnel from the top to the bottom. It's the only marketing function that does own the funnel from the top to the bottom. And even as you'll sort of see here, it starts before the funnel. So it's responsible for the product portfolio and the market success of it, as opposed to how it functions and that type of thing, which is the domain of folks in the product area. Because those two areas, whether product marketing, product management, also get confused a bit, and sometimes that role is held by, both roles are held by the same person. So they're responsible for the product portfolio, for the market success of it. And by way of achieving that success, you really need to build a deep knowledge of the market, the customers and the competitors, and provide input into the roadmap and the strategy, as well as to be able to clearly communicate to the market where you stand, how you're going to be thought of by the customer or prospect, and to be able to differentiate the product and ultimately monetize it. A lot of startups start with really good ideas. We build it, they'll come, maybe faulty business models, which are some of the reasons that you saw earlier in the slide for failure. Product marketing is also not just developing collateral, you know, and webinars, things like that. We actually have to make sure we can monetize the product. And finally, it's to make sure that the sales teams can sell it, whether it's direct or indirect, that they can meet with a customer and they can confidently present what the value proposition is and why they should change from what they're doing today to our alternative. So as I just laid out a little bit more detail here, if you kind of look at it from left to right, it really starts in the left-hand side with identifying what is the market opportunity. There's different ways that we go about kind of evaluating what are all the possibilities out there. I've worked with many companies, startups and otherwise, that have maybe 10 different use cases that they might be looking at and figuring out how they're going to attack those. Some try to do all 10 at once, which doesn't usually end very well. So it's first identifying what the opportunities are, then breaking that down and figuring out where the focus is going to be, you know, looking at different factors.
And Mark, could I just ask quickly,
Yep.
you know, for companies that do have, let's say, you know, 3 or more of these use cases, like how do you sort of think about, you know, organizing that and sort of prioritizing that? Like, is there sort of a go-to sort of methodology that you think about for that?
Sure. So, and I'll get into that a little bit more later in the deck, but effectively that is to, once we kind of have all the opportunities, to then segment and prioritize them. And how we segment them can include a number of different factors. Who are we competing in the market? What's the different technologies and things out there that may make a company, if we're selling technology, more ready for what we're selling, company sizes, verticals. There's a lot of different factors that we take into account and weight them and ultimately generate a prioritized heat map, if you will, which I'll show you later in the deck. And so once we have that focus, we say, okay, what is the go-to-market? We've prioritized them. What's our sales strategy, our account strategy, our channel play? Are we direct? Are we a SaaS business? Just because we're a SaaS business doesn't mean we don't sell through channels. You know, there's a lot of different avenues to market. If you kind of look at it classically in terms of there's the 4 Ps, the product, price, and promotion, and place being channel. All those 4 Ps are ones that product marketing owns. So figuring those things out, the different buyer focus, looking at the buyer's journey, how they buy. Sometimes it might be individual, and this holds true. I mean, I largely, a lot of stuff in here may skew towards B2B, but these things same hold true in a B2C environment. Even to the extent that you know, I make a distinction later between the buyer and the user. Even though I may be both the buyer and the user, you have to look at it from different perspectives because there's different thought processes that go into it and stuff like that. So looking at how products are bought, whether it's just from an individual or a team, if you're like a large enterprise type of offering, and then how we're going to communicate that to the market, developing the messaging, different buyer personas, a pain chain being how does that affect the organization, different people in the organization, and then arming the sales team and the marketing team with the assets to go out and communicate that message, to take it from the awareness stage through decision stage and be able to help not just bring in deals, but close deals, which again is the full funnel focus within that there. You know, when it comes to the assets, then you start getting into working with other functions of marketing that may be marketing communications, demand generation. They could be channel manager. There could be lots of different functions of marketing. But up to that point, that is primarily the domain of product marketing, and then it's to enable the sales team and the marketing teams beyond that. And there's separate columns here, but rightly so. And in a certain sense, maybe as I look at this, it could be reversed, but actually launching the product and getting it out into the market in terms of the programs that you're going to support, et cetera. And then again, kind of like I mentioned earlier, sales enablement, getting the tools, the training, making sure that they understand the competitive environment, if they're doing demos, things like that. That's all what the product marketing function is there to arm and enable a sales team. So before all that kind of stuff takes place, you're really faced with two strategic questions that product marketing is there to address and answer. And so the first is how much complexity can you handle? We go back to the use cases, as you'll see in the next slide. Well, those use cases can then have other variables attached to them. It may be selling into a different function. It may be selling into a different size organization. And pretty quickly, it can get pretty complex. So any organization has limited capacity to handle it. In a startup, you have no margin to handle it. You got to make sure you're focused. So, which brings to the second piece, which is to how are we going to focus the product development, the marketing and sales efforts so that we get the most return on our effort and maximize our growth, our market share, and our profitability. In some senses, you hear the terms like sales and marketing alignment. That's a piece of it. This piece comes a bit earlier in the sense that it's more kind of figuring out the strategy and orchestrating that across the functions. So that's, again, the two main questions that we set out to answer when we're doing this. So, by way of illustrating this is one company that they start out, they have 4 different products, a bunch of use cases, and then, well, okay, for different ones, do we have to support different standards or the different initiatives, differences in geographies, different systems that are supporting? And this is actually a condensed list of some of the variables that come into play. So, Grant, you were talking about, okay, how do we begin to make some decisions and things like that? These are some of the factors that come into play. So, but if you also think about it, and this has happened to me on a couple of occasions, not just in a startup, but in larger companies, the sales team is very quickly overwhelmed. It's really difficult to keep them up to speed with what's going on so that they are selling and they're out in both marketing and sales are talking in language that's credible, that's relevant to their audience, because the broader you go, without any depth, you become more generic. It's harder to make an impact. It's harder to differentiate yourself in the market and ultimately to succeed. So complexity is the enemy. I would say enemy number one if you're in a startup. So how do we go about beginning to answer that? And that introduces the concept of the ideal customer. What is your ideal customer? And until you really know that, figuring out your channels, your pitch, your pricing, your messaging, you can't do it, because otherwise you're shooting in the dark. You're misaligned. You're in a fire ready aim mode. So what is an ideal customer, and what is an ideal customer? Mark, where did my slide go? Oh, wow, here, I'm gonna improvise here. You can find a prospect that has budget, authority, need, and a timeline. That's great. There's someone who will buy your product in all likelihood, but that's not necessarily who you want to be going after. You want to be going after your ideal customer, which means that they're going to be someone that's going to be successful with your product. You can acquire them and support them profitably. You can expand within them. There's upsell, there's cross-sell, and they're going to be an advocate for you. Your NPS score, they're going to tell people about it. That's the ideal customer. That's who you want to go after. Talking to Grant earlier, it's like, well, we're concerned with customers that churn. If we're looking at getting to product market fit, that's in effect saying we found our ideal customer because they're not churning, they're buying more. We can have a repeatable sales process around them. So, but the problem in getting to an ideal customer more often than not is FOMO. We're afraid of missing out on the rest of the market. We're afraid of missing opportunities. But it's like the saying goes, you can't be all things to all people. And when you don't focus, you don't connect with anybody, and you make it that much more difficult to reach your ideal customer. So with that said, and just to be clear, there's probably people here saying, well, it's really early for us. We don't know who our ideal customer is. And to a certain extent, that's the point of things here is, when you're in a startup, you're starting out with a hypothesis about who your ideal customer is. And we'll kind of get to that a bit more when I start to talk about the segmentation piece. But you can also kind of get hung up on, if you're at an early stage, about this concept of the ideal customer. So I think we'll kind of, if it's not clear here now, like how that relates to when you're at an earlier stage, I'll flesh that out a little bit later.
Yeah, Mark, I think the thing that people probably struggle with is, I've got some customers that are looking good, right? Like some are buying, unit economics look pretty solid. Maybe another group's looking pretty solid too. So you have that FOMO in play. You don't want to write one off, right? So it's sort of like, how do you make the bet, right? Even once you've identified those personas and maybe collected a little bit of data.
No,
maybe
totally.
That plays into the segmentation here.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're carrying a quota, it's really easy to, either a bluebird flies in the window, think there's going to be, n number more of those, I mean, and not to say you're not going to be opportunistic, but it's a question of where you're going to spend your time. You got limited time, resources, and whether you're talking about you're in sales, you're in marketing, whatever, or, you're just burning cash, right? The more diffuse you get, the harder it is. And so, this needs-based segmentation, as you can kind of see, it's a heat map. Takes into account a few different things that are behind this. But there's the size of the market, there's the growth of the market, there's a variety of factors that are here. That if you're in the tech space and you see up here fog computing, well, I don't know how many people on this call have ever heard of that, but that's a client that I worked with where their product and everything fits really well with them, but that's a little ball there because it's really early and emerging market, as opposed to remote asset management, which is a big, more mature use case there and play. So, I mean, that I think sort of illustrates maybe what you're talking about. Excuse me. I think we were offline, we were talking about this, Grant, but where you are in the market, and if you're early and timing things as well. So this is, again, I'm kind of, this is a one-on-one. I'm giving you the overview. There's obviously a lot more as you dig into it. How do you build this? How do you do it? But the concept remains the same, is this is a mechanism for getting at your ideal customers. And you can think of that if you're doing, say, account-based marketing or individuals. The term customer is sort of context dependent a bit too, but nevertheless, it's the same factors that you take into account when you're looking to do this and build this. So that's kind of, okay, we've identified the market, the growth, the competitive factors, all that kind of stuff. And now we actually get more focused on the buyers and the things that product marketing is responsible for in terms of focusing attention on the buyers. And I think kind of went through this in the earlier part. This is where we get into the developing the messages, which is the platform that these other things launch off of, whether it's the content, whether it's the programs, whether it's sales enablement. And you may be sitting here saying, well, wait a minute, what is, like, he's got like social on here, he's got inbound and outbound. What does that have to do with product marketing? Well, what that has to do with product marketing is that you start to get into more specialized functions within marketing, whether it's PR, whether it's doing SEO, whether it's doing social. All of those things are informed by product marketing, because product marketing is tasked with being the expert on the customer, understanding what their day-to-day challenges are, what their incentives are, the language that they use when they talk about the problems that they have. So how do you do a keyword or set up a Google campaign if you don't know the language of the buyer and what they're going to search on? So those people and those functions optimize the things that product marketing delivers. And again, so Grant and I were talking earlier, and this is where we get into a lot of the sort of fire ready aim is like, well, we need to run lead generation. We need to do social. We need to get out on all these things. And if you're not doing it in an informed way, you may get lucky, but you're not necessarily going to be spending your money wisely and your time wisely in doing that. So this, again, kind of gets back to the shift left concept of put the time in beforehand to make sure we know what we're doing. I'm not using the words get it right, because it's always an experiment, but that you actually have a solid hypothesis about who you're going after at the early stage. I mean, when you get the sales motion and going and you hit product market fit, that's a different story. But and it's still always a hypothesis that you're doing, because the market's constantly changing. But making sure you have solid hypotheses that then when you go and run these programs, you will validate or invalidate the results that you're getting. But you do it bass backwards and you run the programs, you don't really know if you've hit the target, if you're succeeding or you're not. You may get sales, you may get leads, but that's not a foundation you can build upon necessarily. I mean, it's not to say companies are successful without doing this, but they're probably not as profitable.
And Mark, what I was going to say too is I think a lot of early stage companies or entrepreneurs tend to want to solve or are solving problems that they themselves have felt the pain on. So they are pretty down to the customers. So you can have a little bit of a hack where you're like, I do know some of these things, right? I might know what I'd be searching for to solve this problem. But one of the things that I've thought about a lot is I think that's a good sort of catalyst, but it can also work against you if you don't sort of get out of your echo chamber and really validate some of that, either, directly with the customer or by bringing, outside perspective in.
Well, and yeah, what you just described is what we call confirmation bias. And it's something that, lots of founders, I won't say suffer from. I mean, we're humans, and it's like people aren't defective, but to have objectivity is really difficult. Yeah, I mean, most founders, whether you're not technical per se, but you started the company because you had a problem that you couldn't find, you didn't feel like anybody was solving. Question is, and you go back to reason number one why startups fail in the CB Insights, it's like 45% of them is that, well, it was a good idea, but there wasn't enough of a market to support it. So, to your point, it informs where you're going, but you need to validate it, and you need someone that, can call bullshit on you that if you have a company where everybody is like totally drinking the Kool-Aid, which I've seen, it's ultimately not good. You need someone in the room to say, Grant, the CEO, I'm not so sure about that. So, all the stuff that we're going through here is, tools, tactics, etc. But you can't remove the human element from all of this and the dynamics and the teams. And to the extent where you're early stage and you're wearing more hats, it's really harder to have that objectivity as well. If you're if you're coding, you're marketing, you're selling, and you're fundraising, that's a lot right there. And, it's even harder to kind of have the bandwidth to maintain that. So back to our regular scheduled program. We've done all that. The question is how are we going to get out there and how are we going to influence the buyers? And the key word here is influence. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. We need to figure out, of all the channels that are out there, how are we going to get that message out there, and how do we do it at the right time with the right message? And there's sort of three main components to this, which I'll go through: the value proposition, your positioning, and your messaging. And these quite often get confused. And I'd say case in point, if you Google positioning versus messaging, you'll hit my website. And I know I get a lot of hits on that. It's the number one thing on Google. So it's something that a lot of folks at all company sizes don't really get the distinction between. So when I say influence, I come back to this, which is to say that if you look at this, which if you've never seen it before, maybe a little bit shocking, when you break it down, 90% of the people out there are not, really in the position to be buying. And when you cut it down to 10%, to the top 10%, only 3 of them are actively looking for something to solve the problem that they have. And the other 7% of them are, they know they have a problem, and they intend to do it, but they just quite haven't got there yet. And there's 30% of them that say, well, I'm beginning to understand I have a problem, but we're doing nothing. So that gives you a pretty tight window to try to be operating in. And then even if it hits on your pipeline, no decision, do nothing, the status quo is what you lose out to most often. Excuse me. So that's pretty daunting, if you think about it, task to be going out and trying to find people, especially in this environment, that are actually going to go and make a change. So the function here in terms of product marketing is to help the buyer answer these 3 questions. And this is a function of, from the top of the funnel all the way down. But every, sale, what you buy when you go buy a new toothpaste, whatever, you're really answering these questions, right? Why do I need to make a change? Why do I need to do it now? Which is probably among the 3 the most difficult task, because again, while those things that get into the funnel, they've understood there's a need to make a change, but no decision is, well, not just yet, not now. We haven't made a decision on it. And then I think it's easier to differentiate yourself from the competition, because again, that's not where you're losing. You're losing from do nothing. So the big emphasis on product marketing is to try to answer that why now question. And so again, sort of the 3 components that feed into this start out with the value proposition. And this is, if you go back to the lean canvas, really what's your thesis for your business? What do you bring, and how do you articulate that in terms of the overall benefits that you're going to provide someone, and why it's worth them taking out their credit card in order to do that? What is it? Why are people buying? Amongst all the things that are out there in the marketplace, what need do you fill? There's lots of alternatives, ways that you can solve a problem. I can get from point A to point B. I can walk, I can take a car, I can take my bicycle. We all know, on and on. So like, what need are you really filling in the marketplace? And what is your advantage over those others? Why should I take my car over my bike? Why should I bike over my car, et cetera? The most simplistic form, but that's, encapsulates the value proposition when you're talking about this. So, and these things aren't just marketing constructs. They are important, because if everybody in your company doesn't understand this and isn't behind it, you're sunk, because you need everybody, especially in this earlier stages, to be aligned around what it is that you're doing and what you're selling. Because if people are confused around that problem is going to multiply itself in the market. If 3 people talk to 3 people and each of them is saying something different, then that's a problem. You need to be going out there with a message that everybody's in agreement with. So, and that's where we get to the positioning. So you take that, and that's a subset of your value proposition that you got there, and you're trying to highlight what the needs of the people are, and basically stand out in their mind. So like to declutter that and to establish a place in their mind of how they're going to think about what it is that you're offering and how it's different from what else is out there, and in terms of what they're currently doing and what competitive alternatives may be. And so then you go to your messaging, which is there to support that positioning that you've established in your mind. Positioning you can be different for different people, for the same product within an organization, because if people are going to have different problems. If you're talking to the C-suite, they're going to perceive the problem that you're solving to be different than someone who may be in accounting or bookkeeping. So your positioning is context dependent, but it's ultimately consistent, which goes back to a concept that I mentioned earlier. It's called the pain chain, because if somebody in the bookkeeping department is getting behind because they can't do something, that's a pain for them that may have to do with software that they're using. But when they get behind in their bookkeeping and that rolls up to the CEO and they don't have good numbers and they can't understand where their business is at, that's a whole different pain. And so how you position that offering is going to be different depending on who you're talking to. How do you then kind of articulate that positioning at a more fine-grained level? That's where you get into the concept of messaging. And within that, there's tiers to that. The first one starts off with basically qualifying messaging. That's table stakes. Are you viable at the most basic level to solve that problem? It's not there to differentiate you. Then you start to get into differentiating messages that you've got to tie to the benefits that set you apart from the competition. And this also, when I say competition, the competition is do nothing as much as it is, Oracle versus SAP. And then the substantiating messages to further call out those differentiating messages and lend credibility to it. We can't go out there and say what we're different for something that someone can poke holes in. Although at times you'll do it, it's aspirational and you differentiate yourself, but it's more aspirational and not necessarily something you can back up. And at an earlier stage, that's a proposition that you need to consider and figure out where you're going to go with that, because you may feel like you can do something, but you may have a hard time actually backing that up. And then once you get that, that's where you start to go out, and there's a lot of talk. If you go on LinkedIn, you hear Andy Raskin, you hear these people say storytelling. That's what we need to be doing, is telling stories. People don't remember statistics. They don't remember features. They don't remember speeds and feeds, how fast your thing goes, but they remember stories. Well, in order to be able to tell a story, you need to have this core messaging in place. So, and that folds into your content strategy. And that's where you get really this focus on the full funnel. And this is where different subsets of marketing and the sales team may come into play, with how they use content and distribute it and things like that. But again, the product marketing function is responsible for the messaging that's behind that creates the content that then gets into people's hands through different methods at different points in the buyer's journey. So that's anything from, if you're doing blog posts, to doing product demos, to doing things like this, like webinars, tutorials, etc. And even to a certain extent, this probably should be updated to extend past the sale, because you get into customer success, and they need materials, and they need to walk that line between continuing to sell the product, support the product, but they need messaging too that's in line with that, because if they fall off and they're saying something different than the customer's heard all the way up to this point, and people are making it up as they go along, you got a problem there too. So I'm starting to get towards the end of all this, so if you could just sit tight, because I do want to leave some time for questions, and I realize we're running a little bit tight. I'm gonna try to pick up the pace a little bit, but then you get into the actual product introduction and the product launch, and there's a lot of moving parts that need to be orchestrated to do this successfully. And again, that's the role of product marketing. If this all sounds like a lot, it's because it is, but it's also vitally important to get it right. So that means, again, arming the sales team, the marketing team, making sure that they understand the competitive environment that they're going out into, what the market landscape looks like, where there may be pitfalls, where they're going to get pushback, giving them tools to deal with objections. All that stuff is stuff that product marketing and the sales team need to work hand in hand with. If you're talking about going out and running the marketing programs into this, well, there also has to be an alignment between sales and marketing to understand what that funnel map looks like. What does a lead look like? When is it going to get passed off? What are the qualification requirements for that? That's vitally important and often trips up companies because sales says, well, we didn't get any qualified leads, and marketing says, well, we sent you these leads, and you get into a problem there because you haven't aligned that up front. Well, the product marketing team is perfectly positioned to align that, to make sure that stuff runs smoothly throughout there, and ultimately to train up the sales team, make sure that they're prepared to go out there and do what they need to do and do it effectively. So who is the person that does this, that can handle this kind of role? They need to be a facilitator. They need to be an influencer. They need to both produce and be responsible for certain things on their own, but also enable other folks to use it. It takes what we call a T-shaped set of skills. You need to have a broad knowledge, and you need to have deep experience. You need to be both creative and analytical. You need to be able to be a quick learner, or have some considerable experience in a particular domain or industry, because it's really difficult to be deliver things that are relevant and credible to your audience if you don't have that. That's where a lot of companies get into trouble, because they go and they hire an outside agency or firm that are more generalists, that are ultimately, while they say we may work in SaaS, which could be anything, it's just software as a service as opposed to its shrink wrap software, and say, well, we have experience in this industry. And they do know, and they do have some experience. I'm not trying to denigrate them, but they need to be informed enough about how your product fits in the context of all that. And if you don't have someone that can deliver that to an agency outside to then run with and do the legwork or scale it up, you're in trouble. And a lot of companies, they take a shortcut because they say, oh, we're going to go work with X agency. They have experience in SaaS, and it creates these kind of problems unless you have somebody that can really keep an eye on them and keep them informed and make sure that they are executing against what your message is, what you've done and you develop, and there's no substitute for that. You can't outsource that part of it. You can't outsource your brain. And so you also have to have empathy and influence skills, because both internally and externally, you need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of your prospects, and also the other people that you need to support within the organization, whether it's the people on the product team, whether it's people on the sales team, whether it's the C-suite. They all have different needs, and you need to be able to support it. It's really difficult for me to go in and talk to developers or engineers to try to understand how some of the features of a product may work and why we're building it, or to in turn influence the roadmap, if I don't understand what's at stake for them and how they work, and to be able to understand them and influence them. So there's soft skills that are critically important to this role too. You can't go in with a bull in a china shop, a bulldozer approach, because I've seen it before and it doesn't work. So that's the competencies of the growth architect, because I think, as I've sort of laid out here earlier, that's the blueprint for growth, and these folks are the architects for that growth. So I touched on this earlier, but just to kind of clarify, what is the difference between product marketing and product management? And again, a lot of times early stages, you may have a product manager that's responsible for both these things. You may have a product marketer that's responsible for both these things. And it can be difficult to manage them at the same time and keep them straight, because fundamentally, the product manager has to be focused on the product and the user of the product and their requirements and how it's going to solve a problem when they're actually using the product. Product marketing needs to understand the customer, be the expert on the buyer and what they're going through the process of when they buy the product and how they're going to benefit from it when they buy it. They're two separate and distinct things. Well, again, even if it's an individual, one person that's buying it, I'm buying, most simple toothpaste. I have a way different experience when I'm actually picking that up off the shelf than when I'm actually home using it and the tube gets scrunched up, so on and so forth. And somebody needs to be laser focused on how that product is being used, and another person has to be laser focused on how the product is being purchased. Now, obviously, there are constraints at times, and you have to do both, but it's also the challenges anybody who's probably doing this knows, is to keep the user and the buyer separate. So with that, I know there's a lot of people on here that have a SaaS model to their business. And if you try to tie it back to that, how product marketing impacts this, we talked about it earlier. If you don't have the right customer, you're gonna experience churn. You're not going to get the right activation rate. You're not going to be able to charge the optimal amount for your product. You're going to see hits in your recurring revenue, either because it's going to drop, or you may not even have it priced right. So product marketing also looks at pricing. Do you have the right kind of pricing tiers? Do you have too many gaps in there? So all those things are a function of that. And really, kind of going back to, if you're concerned about cash, the cost of acquiring a customer. If we're out there and we're spray and pray in our marketing efforts or in our sales efforts, because we're not bringing in the right people, the leads that come in that are not good leads, that sales ends up spending time with, are ultimately a cost to you. You want to be focused on the customers that are going to buy. So customer acquisition is a huge thing, and obviously some of these metrics are interrelated. Customer lifetime value is a function of if they churn and how much you can charge for them, et cetera. So these are all things that product marketing impacts. And if we go back to the ideal customer profile earlier, we talked about, okay, I may meet BANT criteria, but if there's me and there's Grant, and Grant has 4 other guys on his team that can use the product, well, he's a better customer than me. And if we hit him right and he's seen the value of it, and we haven't misled him in what we've been selling, we've understood the buyer, and and the product team has understood the user, then they're going to be satisfied with what they got, and it's going to result in net promoter scores that are higher, and we're going to get more customers. So this is, I think, kind of case in point, brings together a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. So just to kind of wrap things up and come back to the concept of shifting left and how product marketing impacts that. You've got the market need, which we've talked about most of these things over the course of the conversation I have. But I think you can start to see how this stuff ties back. We talk about market validation and customer discovery being really critical at an early stage, and taking into account how we do that in a segmentation exercise and a prioritizing exercise, so that we're making sure that we're not pulling all our eggs or putting too many resources into going after fog computing, that we've properly calibrated for that, we focus on the right customers. We don't ignore the ones that are ideal customers because we have FOMO. We're not spraying and praying with our marketing, and we have a business model that can support it because we validated that there's a value proposition and a channel model for that. We don't end up putting a product out there that doesn't fit the buyer's needs because we have ostensibly sold them something that meets those needs and solves the problems that they have. I mean, a perfect example is a lot of stuff that's been going on lately around COVID. I don't know how many remote work survival kits there are out there, COVID survival kits. Well, everybody under the sun has one of those things. And some of those are, they're vapor. They're not really things that are going to help people out, but people are going to buy them because they feel like they need to. But at the end of the day, they're going to be like, this doesn't this isn't the product that I need. It's not really solving the problem.
So Mark,
Yeah.
I think that's a good segue into, like, there's some really good questions that have come in, and I want to make sure. I actually have one myself, going back to sort of how we focus around that 3%. You've got your
Yeah.
persona, but then within that, there's sort of a 3% that you have to build a strategy around. So I'd love to get into that, but I think first I want to just throw a couple questions out from the audience.
Cool. This is the
And
fun part. This is why I
yeah,
do this.
this would be awesome. So there's two questions here. Actually, a few of these are kind of interrelated, but one person's asking, about, really what's like, how should you look at growth marketing versus product marketing? And I think if we could kind of combine two questions, another piece of that is like, where do you find product marketers spending more of their time at the pre-seed stage versus maybe once they've like raised the seed round, something like that? Like, how does that role evolve? And so maybe talking about the evolution of like where the focus is as a product marketer, as the
Sure.
company grows, but then also like who's handling growth marketing versus product marketing, and like, are they the same or are they different?
Yeah, I mean, so again, there's a lot of buzzwords when it comes into marketing, and I throw in there that there's a growth hacker, which I don't necessarily even think is the same thing. I don't think is the same thing as the growth marketer. So in my experience, the distinction between them, and some may argue with this, and I'd be happy to explain it depending on what their definition is that the growth marketer typically takes over to grow existing business, I guess is the way that I would think of it. And so to a certain extent, I would say that there is, it's almost like a Venn diagram, and ultimately it comes down to the organization, I think, and how they kind of maybe define the roles, which comes back to what is very common when it comes to this role of product marketing in general is that it's defined it's defined differently at different organizations. In some places you'll go like in a technical realm, and if this is all they're doing, it's a problem. But it's product marketing is subservient to the product management team, and they're the people that write the data sheets and brochures and presentations, because they understand it. So all the way up to kind of what I described, which is it's a very strategic role that you have people that are at the VP level in the C-suite that oversee this. So I digress a little bit, but I'm hard pressed to answer that with specifics, because both growth marketing and product marketing are not strictly defined, at least in my experience. So I think what I would say to whoever asked it is, we'd have to look at what is it you're trying to accomplish, and what do you need to do there, and what are the skill sets that are required, and how do you want to structure your organization going forward? Do you want to have people that are focused on whatever you might term growth marketing versus product marketing? And
Like
I mean, you said something about an early stage there that I wanted to,
like for me on growth marketing versus product marketing, I mean, I feel like product marketing is trying to sort of build that foundation and answer some of those fundamental questions in the packaging of it. And growth marketing is like, okay, how are we going to unlock some disproportionate growth or some avenues for putting this into practice, right? So it sort of gets
right.
more like tactical, like you think about Airbnb and like how they use Craigslist. So that's maybe more growth hacking, but that versus, a sort of channel sales play, right, in a more traditional sense.
Right. Well, and to your point, I mean, again, this is like, it might be the case that, well, in order for, and I think this is what you're saying, for them to use Craigslist, somebody still needs to inform, like, why are we even looking at Craigslist, right? So like, where did that come from? And is that part of like, the core stuff, the messaging, et cetera, that the product marketing team would do? Because what I would say, if I go back, a few slides, which I won't, is that becomes a question of what channels. Craigslist is a channel. The channel's not going to drive your strategy. The channel's a piece of executing your strategy. You may stumble, it's not to say folks don't stumble upon a channel or try out a channel that then, okay, we've got something here, and we incorporate a strategy around it. I mean, none of this stuff is completely, one way, but by and large, you want to have, okay, we understand the buyer. This is where he lives. He's going to be on Craigslist. She's going to be on Craigslist. That's why we're going to go to Craigslist. I don't think anyone just said, I woke up this morning, let's just try Craigslist. There had to be something informing that.
Yeah.
So.
And another question on here, sort of, I feel like what we've heard today is really like a primer and like a step-by-step approach to thinking about putting your like product marketing strategy together. If we go one layer down, Ping King has a question around like just a couple maybe go to either tools or frameworks that you could recommend around market sizing or defining and building out some of your like early customer segmentation, like how to kind of put the pen to paper there a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So, I'd be happy, to talk afterwards or outside of this. There's definitely tools. I have spreadsheet models that I've built that generate that, that heat map that I showed you and take into account the weighting and things like that. If the question is, where do you get the data? Then, that's another, piece of the equation, another story. And that's where, it's, you're at the early stages, limited, you got to get creative. I had like no budget to do anything. And I went to, there's various analysts that will put out market sizing data in their synopsis that you'd otherwise have to pay like $1,500 to get a report on, that you can, so you can string together a lot of, pretty decent data of projections and things like that just by hunting around and scraping it. Obviously the more resources you have, the more you can start to talk to different analysts and things like that. But that's kind of like where, I said, you got to be creative, and you got to be analytic. You got to be a problem solver. You got to figure out, if you're in an early stage, how you scramble around, how you solve for that. And that's kind of how I've done
One
it.
more question here. I know we're at the hour. People may have to jump, but I thought this was a really good one, especially for some of the earlier stage teams, or if you're like an entrepreneur working at a larger company and you're trying to maybe get support for an idea or a product that you have. Like, what's the sort of best first step that you have? And I can give an answer on this too, but sort of to validate an idea before you do anything, right? Before you build an MVP, like how do you kind of build some confidence in your idea? And I'll defer to you first, Mark, if you want to take that.
Sure. And interesting that you say that. So, it comes back to this hypothesis, and before you build anything, before you, write a line of code, you can test that. And because, and I'll jump ahead. I'm saying in the question section, I can, so this is what you don't want to have happen typically. If you're launching, if you're focused on the product and getting it right, you go through release cycles, you add features, and you're burning cash, you're taking yourself out over time. This is when you take that product-based approach. If you take an approach, and this is okay, you're focused on the product and the Scrum. I do what I call a market sprint, where I go and I develop a hypothesis and I go out and test that against not necessarily market research, like would you buy something, if it was available, but term for it, it's vaporware. We go out, we start running ads for it. We make calls, we offer up white papers around this, whatever, and we begin to test, is there a pain point that we're attacking? And I look at it because it's not just, it's the idea, but you basically got 3 different channels, rather variables that come into play what you want to do this, because you got to get the right, do we have the right offer? Are we hitting on the right target customer? Have we pushed it out over the right channel? This goes back to your Craigslist, your things like that. So, this is a you call it market testing, customer discovery exercise that you can do. And this holds true whether you're a startup or you're launching a new product within a new company. You don't want to invest, you can do it without building an MVP. A lot of times the focus is on building the MVP, and then we do this. that to me, you've missed the boat. You've invested money in it. You can be doing it concurrently, but if you don't have anything, you don't have developers, you don't have anything, you can test the message. You can do this. And depending on what your resources are to put behind it, it's a hell of a lot cheaper than building something. This goes back to kind of the shift left approach, right? So again, whether you're internally doing this to kind of test and launch a new product, or you're you're in a startup, you haven't even started the company yet, this is an approach you could take. And this is what I've done with with pre-revenue early stage companies.
And there are a lot of good tools to do this. If you're trying to put a product in front of someone, like Envision makes it really easy to like make a clickable kind of prototype. We have customers at established companies that use Unstack, where they'll build out a really high fidelity landing page with product designs that they've done, and actually A/B test click-through rates and signups and collect feedback there, and then socialize that internally. So you can use some of these tools, whether it's Unstack or Envision or other tools out there, to basically make yourself look like you're already in market and really put that message in front of people and see how they respond. So there's a bunch of ways to do that on the cheap with just a little bit of time and very, very low cost.
And this wasn't even a plant. That's how we met, because I was doing this for a client, and used Unstack to build out their site and to build some landing pages and make it look like we had a lot more to offer than we did at the time. So absolutely, it's a great tool for that.
Thanks. So I think we're 6 over. I think we're going to call it. This was a great session for everybody who joined. We're going to be following up, so you have access to this as a resource. If you have more questions for Mark, he's going to reach out too. I think Mark, we've got some free sessions potentially available. You're doing a survey. So if you have questions or you need help, you just need extra hands, or you need that experience to help you navigate some of these questions, Mark is here to do that. We'll also follow up, if anybody is looking for some of those tools to validate faster, take some of, Mark's ideas and put them in motion using Unstack. We've got something for you as well. And you'll hear from us after the fact. So I just want to say, Mark, again, thank you for putting this together. Thank you for the time, and thanks for everybody, for joining us and learning about product marketing.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so everybody, once you exit this webinar, you'll actually be given a survey. A really great offer is Mark is actually offering up an Ask Me Anything session. He's doing a drawing from that survey submission, so definitely make sure to go through and finish that up. And then our friend Daniel from Unstack will go ahead and send along all the recordings for this.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and good luck out there.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, guys.
Bye.